Everyone expected the Alpha King to claim Sibylla as nothing more than a concubine. Instead, the very shadow that birthed their kind emerged from the abyss. The ensuing silence in the grand hall was so absolute that the rush of blood in 100 terrified veins became deafening as the ancient entity locked eyes with hers and sank into a low bow. The cobblestones of Oakhaven were slick with autumn rain and the bitter frost of early winter. In the lower wards, survival was not a right. It was a daily negotiation with starvation. Sibylla was an Omega, a dirty word whispered by the high-born wolves who paraded through the upper tiers of the citadel, draped in velvet and the arrogance of their unbroken lineages. She scrubbed the floors of the apothecary owned by Miller Thomas, and she kept her head down. In a pack ruled by the ruthless House Redfern, anonymity was the only armor a wolf like her possessed. But tonight was the Blood Moon Festival, the decennial mating ceremony where the Alpha King, Kaelin, would select his new mates to solidify his political power. King Kaelin was a tyrant whose cruelty was matched only by his vanity. His reign had been built on the slaughtered bodies of rival packs. The entire city was ordered to attend the ceremony in the Great Hall. Attendance was not a request. Blacksmith Kale had been publicly flogged the day prior merely for questioning the mandatory curfew leading up to the event. Sibylla stood in the freezing, drafty fringes of the Great Hall, huddled beside Odelia, the harsh matron who had taken her in after her parents were executed for treason. Her parents had belonged to the fallen House Ashdown. They were true, honorable wolves, but history is written by the victors. To Kaelin, the Ashdown blood was a stain to be mocked, and she was its last, pathetic remnant. Odelia's fingers dug into her arm like talons. "Keep your eyes on the flagstones, Sibylla," she hissed, her breath reeking of cheap ale and fear. "If you draw his gaze, I will drown you in the river myself before his guards can drag you to the dungeons." The heavy oak doors groaned, and the heralds sounded the horns. The air in the hall shifted violently. The scent of sharp cedar and ozone, Kaelin's overpowering alpha pheromones, flooded the room, forcing the weaker wolves to their knees. The pressure in Sibylla's chest was agonizing. She fought the instinctual urge to bare her throat, forcing her gaze to remain fixed on the dirt beneath her worn leather boots. Kaelin strode down the center aisle, flanked by his betas, Silas and Rowan. The king was undeniably striking, with pale golden hair and ice-blue eyes, but his beauty was sharp, like shattered glass. He walked with the predatory grace of a wolf who had never known defeat, his heavy velvet cloak sweeping over the stones. He paused before the ranks of the nobility, inspecting the daughters of lords and generals, Lady Clara, who practically vibrated with eagerness, and Beatrice, who lowered her eyes with a practiced, coquettish blush. But Kaelin didn't stop at the noble tier. To the absolute horror of the assembled pack, the Alpha King descended the stairs into the lower fringes. The crowd parted like water before a bow. The silence was deafening. Sibylla's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Pass by," she prayed to the moon goddess. "Please, pass by." A heavy, velvet-clad arm shot out. A hand, rough and adorned with heavy gold signet rings, clamped around her jaw. She gasped as she was violently jerked upward, her hood falling back to reveal her face to the entire hall. Kaelin's ice-blue eyes bored into hers. A cruel, triumphant smirk played on his lips. Well, his voice boomed, carrying effortlessly to the vaulted ceilings. "The last little Ashdown rat. You've grown since I had your father's head put on a pike." A collective gasp rippled through the nobility. Odelia whimpered, dropping to the floor and pressing her face to the dirt, abandoning her instantly. "My king," she rasped, struggling to speak through his crushing grip on her jaw. "I need a third concubine," Kaelin announced to the crowd, his voice dripping with theatrical mockery. "The nobility provides strength, yes, but to remind the pack of what happens to those who defy House Redfern, I shall take the lowest of the low. The last Ashdown will warm my bed and scrub my boots. A fitting end for a traitorous bloodline." Humiliation burned in her throat, choking back the tears of terror that threatened to spill. She wasn't being chosen for love, or even for lust. She was being chosen as a living, breathing monument to his supreme power, a political prop to be abused and discarded. "Bring her to the dais of the ancestors," Kaelin commanded. Releasing her so violently she stumbled into the arms of his beta, Silas. Silas's grip was unyielding as he dragged her forward, up the stone steps toward the massive granite altar at the front of the hall. The faces of the crowd blurred into a sea of pity and revulsion. She was a dead woman walking, Once marked as a concubine of the king, she would be entirely at his mercy, subject to the cruelty of his higher-ranked mates. She was thrown onto the cold, unyielding stone of the dais. The iron braziers roared to life, casting demonic, dancing shadows across the ancient tapestries that lined the walls. Elder Gideon, the pack's blind spiritual leader, stepped forward, holding a silver chalice filled with the ceremonial wine and myrrh. "Alpha King Kaelin," Elder Gideon chanted, his voice trembling slightly. "To bind this female to your bloodline, we must invoke the blessing of the first wolves. We must pour the blood upon the runestone." "Do it," Kaelin snapped, impatient. He unclasped his heavy cloak, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his chest. He turned to her, his eyes flashing yellow as his wolf pushed close to the surface. "Bare your neck, Omega. Let us make your humiliation permanent." Sibylla squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the agony of the breaking of her skin, for the permanent venom that would tie her soul to a monster. But the bite never came. Instead of teeth sinking into her flesh, a sound tore through the great hall, a sound like the earth itself was splitting in two. Elder Gideon had poured the ceremonial blood over the ancient runestone that anchored the dais. Normally, this was a purely symbolic gesture. The stones would absorb the liquid, a prayer would be said, and the mating would proceed. But the moment the blood touched the carved granite, the runes ignited with a blinding, terrifying crimson light. The ground shuddered beneath them. Violent tremors rattled the stained glass windows, cracking the panes. The air pressure in the room plummeted, causing a vacuum that popped the ears of everyone present. "What is this?" Kaelin roared, stumbling backward as the stone floor directly behind the altar began to fracture. "Gideon, control the wards!" "I am not doing this, my king," Gideon shrieked, dropping his silver chalice. The blind elder fell to his knees, his face turned toward the fracturing stone, tears of absolute terror streaming from his milky eyes. "The wards, they are not breaking, my king. They are being opened." A vortex of unnatural, suffocating shadows erupted from the fissure. The scent that accompanied it was not of the forest, or of rain, or of modern wolves. It smelled of ancient earth, of battlefields long forgotten, of ozone, and of raw, primordial power. It was a scent that bypassed the rational brain and triggered the deepest, most primal lizard brain instinct every wolf possessed. Prey. They were all prey. Every single wolf in the room, from the lowest omega to the betas, was forced to the ground. Their knees buckled under the sheer weight of an alpha aura so dense it felt like drowning. Even Kaelin, the mighty Alpha King, was brought to one knee, his face contorted in a mask of furious struggle as he fought the invisible, crushing gravity of the presence entering the room. Only Sibylla remained upright on the dais. The pressure washed over her, but instead of crushing her, it felt strangely like a shield. From the swirling vortex of shadows, a massive claw emerged. It was not a wolf's paw. It was a monstrous, terrifying hybrid of a dire wolf and something far more ancient. Obsidian claws scraped against the granite, gouging deep trenches into the stone. Then, the beast pulled itself into the hall. He was the size of a warhorse. His fur was the color of a starless midnight, thick and scarred with silver lines from battles fought before the foundations of Oakhaven were ever laid. His eyes burned like dying embers, a terrifying, glowing crimson that pierced the gloom. This was no ordinary lycanthrope. This was a myth made flesh. The legend spoke of the first wolves, the ancient guardians who had struck the original pact with the moon goddess. They were thought to be extinct, nothing more than bedtime stories to frighten pups. Yet, here he stood, the obsidian sovereign, Valerius. The beast shook its massive head, letting out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the marrow of her bones. He took a step forward, the sheer physical force of his presence causing the braziers to extinguish, plunging the hall into a twilight illuminated only by the glowing runes and his burning eyes. Kaelin, pushing himself up with a snarl of defiance, wiped a trickle of blood from his nose. His hubris was blinding. He genuinely believed his own propaganda that his bloodline was supreme. "You!" Kaelin shouted over the ringing silence, pointing a trembling finger at the ancient beast. "You are an ancestor. I am the Alpha King of House Redfern. You have come to bless my reign. Submit to your king." The ancient beast stopped. He slowly turned his massive, terrifying head toward Kaelin. For a second, the beast did nothing. Then, the shadows wrapped around the monster, swirling violently. The terrifying wolf form shrank, shifting and breaking with sickening crunches of bone and muscle that sounded like falling timber. When the shadows parted, a man stood in the beast's place. He was extraordinarily tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in fragments of ancient, blackened armor and torn leather. His skin was pale, marked by the same silver scars that had marred his fur. His hair was pitch black, falling unkempt around a face carved from granite. But it was his eyes still that burning, unnatural crimson that held the room hostage. Valerius looked at Kaelin. The ancient warrior didn't yell. He didn't bare his teeth. He merely spoke, and his voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, carrying the weight of centuries. A king? Valerius mused, the archaic cadence of his words thick and foreign. He took a single step toward Kaelin. I smell no king. I smell a frightened pup, playing dress-up in stolen authority. Kaelin roared in fury, a sound of pure desperation, and half-shifted, lunging at the ancient man with his claws extended. Valerius didn't even adopt a fighting stance. As Kaelin closed the distance, Valerius simply raised a hand and flicked his wrist. A wave of pure, kinetic energy erupted from the ancient wolf. Kaelin was thrown backward as if struck by a battering ram. The Alpha King flew through the air, crashing violently into the stone pillars of the hall, crumpling to the floor in a broken, wheezing heap. The gasp from the pack was sharp, but instantly silenced by terror. The untouchable Alpha King had been swatted away like a nuisance fly. Silas and Rowan, Kaelin's betas, didn't dare move a muscle. They remained pressed to the floor, whimpering in absolute submission. Valerius turned away from the bleeding king, dismissing him entirely. His crimson eyes swept across the room, finally locking onto Sibylla where she stood frozen on the dais. Her breath hitched, her heart stopped. He was looking at her, not at the nobles, not at the defeated king. At Sibylla, the tattered Omega of House Ashdown. He approached the dais. With every step he took, the oppressive aura in the room seemed to concentrate, isolating the two of them in a bubble of electrifying tension. He stepped onto the altar, towering over her. She had to tilt her head back just to meet his gaze. She expected to see the cruelty she was so accustomed to, the disdain every powerful wolf held for an Omega. Instead, she saw a profound, startling recognition. Valerius slowly reached out a large, scarred hand. She flinched, bracing for a strike. But his touch was feather-light. His rough thumb brushed against the line of her jaw, the exact spot where Kaelin had bruised her moments before. A jolt of heat, like liquid fire, coursed through her veins at his touch, settling deep in her chest. The blood of Ashdown, Valerius murmured, his voice softening, meant only for her ears. I thought your line was extinguished, little one. The last true protectors of the old pact. She couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. Valerius turned back to face the terrified, prostrate pack. When he spoke, his voice was the undeniable command of a true sovereign, echoing with finality. The throne of Oakhaven is forfeit, Valerius declared, the sound washing over the cowering masses, and this female is no man's concubine. He looked down at her, the terrifying crimson of his eyes softening into a warm, protective hearth fire. To the utter shock of every wolf in the room, the ancient nightmare, the first wolf, dropped to one knee before her and bowed his head. She is my mate, Valerius decreed, and she is your queen. The great hall remained paralyzed, trapped in a collective, breathless suspension. The Alpha King, Kaelin, lay broken and groaning against the far pillars, blood pooling beneath his velvet cloak. Yet, not a single guard moved to assist him. Commander Sterling, the fiercely loyal head of the Citadel Guard, slowly lowered his broadsword, the metallic scrape echoing like a thunderclap in the silent room. One by one, the elite guards dropped to their knees, bowing not to Kaelin, but to the monstrous, ancient man kneeling before her. Valerius rose. His imposing stature cast a long, protective shadow over her. Without asking for permission, he gently swept Sibylla into his arms. She was rigid with shock, her mind completely unable to process that the mythical obsidian sovereign was carrying her a lowly, despised Omega as if she were made of spun glass. He didn't spare another glance at the nobility who had mocked her moments ago. Lady Genevieve, who had laughed at her tattered dress, now wept in sheer terror, pressing her face into the cold flagstones. They bypassed the king's opulent quarters and ascended the winding, forgotten stairs to the highest tower of the citadel, the Sunspire. It was a wing that had been locked away for generations, considered cursed by House Redfern. When Valerius pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, The scent of dust and old parchment filled the air. He set her down on a velvet settee, the fabric faded but impossibly soft. She scrambled back, her knees hitting her chest, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Do not fear me, Sibylla," Valerius rumbled, his voice losing its terrifying booming edge. In the moonlight streaming through the fractured glass, his crimson eyes looked less like hellfire and more like the glowing embers of a protective hearth. "I would sooner tear out my own heart than let harm come to you." "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "I am an Omega. I am nothing. You are the first wolf. A god." Valerius scoffed, a bitter, ancient sound that held centuries of sorrow. He stepped toward the window, looking out over the sprawling, shivering city of Oakhaven. "I am no god. I was a soldier, a guardian, and you are no Omega, Sibylla." He turned to face her, his expression hardening with a righteous fury. "Has the poison of House Redfern run so deep that you do not even know your own history?" She shook her head, entirely bewildered. "My parents were traitors. They conspired against Kaelin's father." "Lies," Valerius growled, the shadows in the room flickering in response to his rising anger. "History written by cowards. House Ashdown were the wardens. When the dark corruption threatened to consume this continent a millennia ago, I bound the corruption to my own soul to save the Pax. But the magic required a physical anchor, a cage. I willingly went into the runestone, falling into an eternal slumber to keep the darkness contained. The Ashdowns were entrusted to guard my tomb." He paced the room, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight. "But power corrupts the weak. Kaelin's grandfather craved the absolute authority of the first wolves. He knew that as long as the Ashdowns guarded the seal, the Redferns could never claim divine right. So, he slaughtered your family. He altered the texts. He painted the wardens as traitors." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The years of scrubbing floors, the beatings from Odelia, the constant, suffocating shame, it was all built on a fabricated narrative designed to suppress the only bloodline that could expose the Redferns' illegitimacy. "Your blood, spilled on the stone, didn't bind you to that pathetic pup, Kaelin," Valerius explained softly, kneeling before her again. "It recognized its warden. It broke the seal. You freed me, Sibylla. The scent of an Omega is merely a biological trauma response. Your wolf has been hiding, suppressing itself to survive in a hostile pack. You are a queen by blood, by right, and by my choosing." Before she could fully process the earth-shattering truth, a frantic pounding echoed from the heavy oak doors of the spire. Commander Sterling burst into the room, his armor clanking, his face pale with dread. "My king, my queen," Sterling panted, dropping to one knee. "Forgive the intrusion. It is Kaelin. Lord Alistair and the Redfern loyalists have barricaded themselves in the armory. They have seized the silver nitrate cannons, and they have taken hostages." Valerius's eyes flared blindingly crimson. "Who?" "The lower ward orphans, sire, and a young boy named Toby. Kaelin demands your immediate surrender in the courtyard, or he will slaughter them all. He claims you are a demon summoned by a witch, not the sovereign." A cold, familiar terror gripped her chest. Toby, the little boy who used to sneak her stolen bread from the baker's kitchens. Kaelin was cornered, stripped of his divine right, and like a wounded, rabid animal, he was willing to burn the entire citadel to the ground to maintain his grip on power. "Stay here," Valerius commanded, his voice vibrating with lethal intent as he summoned his ancient armor from the shadows, the black metal forming over his shoulders. "I will tear him apart." "No," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Valerius paused, looking back at her in surprise. She stood up. Her legs trembled, but for the first time in her life, she didn't look at the floor. She looked the most powerful being in their world dead in the eye. "If you slaughter them, Kaelin's narrative wins. You will be the demon they claim you are. This isn't just your fight, Valerius. Oakhaven is my home. Those are my people. I will not hide in a tower while my pack bleeds." A slow, profoundly proud smile spread across Valerius's rugged face. He extended his hand. "Then we walk together, my queen." The courtyard was a theater of nightmares. Torrential rain lashed against the cobblestones, turning the dirt into thick, sucking mud. Kaelin stood behind a barricade of overturned wagons, his face bruised and mangled from Valerius's earlier strike, but his eyes were wide with the manic desperation of a tyrant losing his grip. Flanking him was Lord Alistair, holding a silver blade to the throat of little Toby, who was sobbing uncontrollably. A dozen Redfern loyalists manned the heavy cannons, their barrels loaded with silver nitrate, a modern, deadly weapon designed to melt a werewolf's flesh from their bones. Valerius and Sibylla stepped out of the heavy iron gates of the keep, standing unprotected in the pouring rain. The collective gasp from the captive hostages and the trembling guards echoed over the storm. "Demon!" Kaelin shrieked, his voice cracking violently. "You think you can steal my birthright? I am the Alpha King. Fire the cannons. Burn them to ash. Hold your fire!" Commander Sterling roared from the battlements above, but the loyalists were too terrified of Kaelin to listen. Alistair sneered, his grip tightening on Toby. "Surrender the Omega beast, or the boy dies." Valerius growled, a sound that shook the very foundations of the courtyard. He stepped forward to shield her, preparing to take the blast of the cannons. But as the artillerists brought their torches to the fuses, something snapped inside her. The years of submission, the generational trauma of House Ashdown, the agonizing suppression of her own wolf, it all shattered. She didn't just feel Valerius's overwhelming power, she felt her own. The blood of the wardens, dormant for decades, roared to life in her veins. Enough. The word tore from her throat, but it didn't sound like the timid voice of the servant she once was. It was layered, resonant, and dripping with an alpha command so pure, so ancient, that it bypassed the ears and struck the soul. The loyalists holding the torches froze. The fire hovered inches from the fuses. Their hands trembled, completely locked by the sheer force of her command. Kaelin whipped around, his face draining of all color as he stared at her. "What is this? Kill her. Kill them both." She stepped out from behind Valerius. With every step she took toward the barricade, the golden warmth spreading through her chest intensified. Her vision sharpened. The scent of fear, rain, and blood became an intricate tapestry of information. She wasn't just walking, she was hunting. "Lord Alistair," she commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy rain. "Drop the blade." Alistair's eyes widened in sheer panic. He tried to press the knife closer to Toby, but his arm wouldn't obey. A warden's command, amplified by the presence of the first wolf, was absolute. With a choked sob of exertion, Alistair's hand opened, and the silver dagger clattered onto the wet cobblestones. Toby instantly bolted, running past the barricades into the waiting arms of the Citadel Guard. Kaelin realized he had lost completely. With a scream of pure, impotent rage, he shifted into his wolf form, a massive, scarred timber wolf, and vaulted over the barricade, lunging directly at her throat. Valerius was a blur of obsidian motion, ready to intercept, but she held up a hand, stopping him. As Kaelin flew through the air, jaws snapping, she didn't flinch. She let her wolf rise. The transformation wasn't the agonizing, bone-breaking torture the Omegas experienced. It was fluid, like water turning to ice. She shifted mid-stride. She was not small. She was not weak. Her fur was a brilliant, blinding white, shimmering with a silver luminescence that cast a halo in the dark, rainy courtyard. She was an Ashdown, the ancient counterweight to the Obsidian Sovereign. She met Kaelin in the air. The collision sounded like two boulders smashing together. But Kaelin's strength was nothing against the awakened blood of a warden. She pinned him to the muddy ground, her jaws clamped firmly around his throat. She didn't bite down. She merely applied enough pressure to let him feel the absolute dominance of her aura. Kaelin whimpered, a pathetic, high-pitched sound. His wolf submitted entirely, his tail tucking beneath his legs, his eyes rolling back in terror. The great, tyrannical Alpha King of House Redfern was completely broken by the Omega he had tried to humiliate. She shifted back to her human form, standing naked in the rain, though the cold no longer bothered her. Valerius was there instantly, wrapping his heavy velvet and fur cloak around her shoulders. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with sheer awe and pride. "House Redfern falls tonight," she announced to the courtyard, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Kaelin and Alistair are stripped of their ranks and titles. They will be banished to the Deadlands. Any who wish to follow them may leave now. But know this. Oakhaven is under the protection of the First Wolves once more. We do not rule with cruelty, we rule with justice." The silence in the courtyard was profound. Then, Commander Sterling dropped to both knees in the mud. "Long live Queen Sibylla," Sterling bellowed. "Long live the Queen," the guards echoed, the sound swelling until the entire courtyard, the hostages, the former loyalists, and the civilians looking out from the windows were roaring the chant into the stormy sky. Valerius stepped beside her, taking her hand in his massive, scarred grip. He didn't demand their cheers. He simply stood beside his mate, the immovable mountain to her storm. She looked up at him, the ancient beast who had torn through the fabric of reality just to choose her. She was no longer the frightened girl scrubbing floors in the apothecary. She was Sibylla Ashdown, and her reign had just begun. The ancient beast did not just choose a mate, he resurrected a legacy. Sibylla, once the dirt beneath Oakhaven's boots, stands today as its fiercest queen. True power is never found in cruelty, but in the enduring strength of the unbroken spirit. The tyranny fell, replaced by an era where no wolf walks in fear. Their legend proves that even the darkest shadows can birth the absolute brightest dawn.